This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India at G7 Summit. The participants are G. Parthasarathi, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing India's participation at the recent G7 summit. We had Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Germany, where he met the G7 leaders along with the other world leaders, and the Prime Minister discussed a number of issues with them. Ambassador Parthasarathi, when we see this particular G7 summit, the focus seems to have been on the Ukraine crisis and also on Russia and the sanctions that the West wants to proceed, further sanctions on Russia. And we also seen that India's stand on the Ukraine crisis has been more nuanced than the Western world. How do you think this G7 summit also helps India and the Prime Minister to put across India's viewpoint to the world?
India's viewpoint to the world on Ukraine is very well known, and the Prime Minister has repeatedly said it, that this has to be settled peacefully by direct discussions between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But the main meeting of our hosts was directed to this. The G7 more or less takes up a Western agenda because its members range from Canada and US to France, Germany, and Britain from Europe, and then on to Japan. They're all Western allies. So the discussions on developments in Ukraine were held by them. They passed their resolutions. And they know quite well what our position is. So the interesting point is that despite their knowing, they had invited us. Now, the fact of the matter is our relations with Germany have always been very good. The amount of economic assistance that we get from Germany is huge. Not that we ask for it, but they provide it, and in very good terms. So they have a particularly high regard for India. We had long discussions with Germany, with whom we have good relations. And we made our proposals quite clear because the discussion was broader, and we made our proposals quite clear that it did not focus on Ukraine, but largely on the question of the economic problems confronting us and environment. We pointed out to the developed countries, and they were all there sitting and listening to the Prime Minister, that look, we have 17% of the world's population, yet pollution from India is barely 5% of the world. Therefore, we will have to do something about it, and the message was very clear to the developed countries that we expect a contribution to them. So on the whole, the Prime Minister came across very clearly on India's views on these pressing issues, environment. And I think one of the important developments which came was a move by the Americans to raise $500 billion for assisting developing countries, primarily in their infrastructure. So that was really the Western powers' answer to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on.
Ambassador Parthasarathi, as you pointed out, we have seen this interesting development where the US has come forward with infrastructure assistance, or we can say it will be a kind of an investment in infrastructure in various nations. Do you feel that this is also somewhere pushing back at China's ambitious, the Belt Road Initiative, and we are seeing these investments across the world which China is making today? Do you feel that for the G7, China is always that elephant in the room which it needs to confront?
Well, there is mixed views on China because even amongst the Americans, you have no dearth of people who are very fond of the Chinese and want to do business. But by and large, there is a wide consensus on China. But coming back to what we have said, the fact of the matter is that we have been pushing for this. And we have been pointing out that from the Chinese projects under that so-called Belt and Road Initiative, Sri Lanka has been driven bankrupt. And this is happening to countries in Africa also. And even the Pakistanis, they are finding the Chinese are very hard when it comes to repayments.
Ambassador Parthasarathi, we also see that the Foreign Secretary has said that Prime Minister Modi, he spoke with world leaders on several issues. And the PM had also appealed earlier to both Russia and Ukraine for peace and an end to hostilities. And as the Foreign Secretary spelled out at the G7 summit, this is a position that the Prime Minister has reiterated, that there must be an immediate end to the hostilities. Do you feel that the world, especially the Western world, is more understanding today of India's nuances when it comes to its foreign policy position. Also, given the sense that India is in the regional equation one of the few countries that can actually stand up and push back China if we look at the regional equation. So maybe that lends the West a greater understanding of India's positions.
Certainly, if President Biden were left to listening to his advisors, then it would have been difficult. But the fact of the matter is that now, even in the US, Biden and others are coming around to the view that they have to do business with India. And you saw the Biden reaching out to the Prime Minister. So the PM has stayed it firm. He says, I am not going to change my view and join you people in condemning Russia for what? Our effort should be to get them to sit down together and to resolve it peacefully.
Ambassador Parthasarathy, the Foreign Secretary, while briefing and answering questions, also highlighted that the Prime Minister has spoken with world leaders on the knockdown effect of the conflict in Eastern Europe on the food security crisis, especially in the vulnerable countries. And this is something which we've been talking about, the global food security, the hunger, and generally the food crisis, which seems to also be emerging as one of the outcomes of the Ukraine crisis. How do you think India can contribute in this matter, and also this helps India then establish itself as a world leader when it comes to global food security?
You see, let's say two things which the external affairs ministers referred to. One is energy, and they wanted us to have no cooperation with Russia and all that. And then we pointed out that the largest buyers of Russian gas, even today, are NATO member states. So that is a point we've made, and we've made it very clear that on these matters we will be guided by our national interests. Taking it further, we will have to see how it goes, because I think they have come to understand that even their own writers are saying they're playing a double game. You can't ask India, as they asked us to, curb our relations with Russia and not buy oil from them when we are getting it on a discount.
We've also seen this picture which has gone pretty viral, and that is of President Biden walking up to PM Modi and they're talking with the Canadian Prime Minister. Do you feel that even though India is not formally a member of the G7 countries, the fact that India is invited and Prime Minister Modi is there among the world leaders also assures India of a place at the world stage where India is today looked upon as one of the emerging world powers?
No, the real success was G20. G20 is a permanent forum. So I think India's economic stature was established then. What is important now is that what we are offering amidst this pandemic are serious proposals, our readiness to expand production of vaccines in India, distribute it across Asia. So I think the working with the Americans and others like-minded like the Japanese in the Asia-Pacific region, or the Indo-Pacific region as it is called, has helped India to now have a standing and image, not just in the subcontinent. You take our West, in recent years, see how the relations with the Gulf countries have improved. Today's Prime Minister is in the United Arab Emirates. Do you know the Indians living there remit back more than $10 billion? So we have now developed, I think, or in the process of developing, not just looking in the subcontinent, but extending across the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific. You are getting an Indian position and presence in a role. And in the case of Quad, which the Prime Minister has just met with, the same thing applies. We discussed not only security, but also development.
Mr. Parthasarathy, another interesting thing that we saw at the G7 summit, and this is India's soft power at display, we saw the gifts that the Prime Minister carried for the world leaders. We had a Gulabi Meenakari brooch, cufflinks, black pottery, a platinum hand-painted tea set, a Zari Zardosi box. These were some of the specialized items that the Prime Minister has gifted to leaders of the G7 summit. And interestingly, all these gifts were made in UP under the One District, One Product scheme. How do you see this initiative? It's like putting India's local products and India's own soft power in a very soft manner, let me put it, when you give gifts which are so traditionally India.
No, I think what is traditionally India is well known. And let me say, when I have served abroad, sadly, the marketing of our handicrafts needs to improve. The Prime Minister has drawn the attention of the world. It's now for us and the people concerned, the businesses concerned, to take this up. Because these are India's treasures. And India is a unique civilization. We are not just a country, we are a civilization. This is a fact we seem to forget. Mahatma Ji always said this. हमारी संस्कृति है, फिर सभ्यता ही नहीं. So I think we need to build on Indian handicrafts, and the Prime Minister has set the example. I hope the private sector follows through, which is what they should be doing, because missions abroad, I know, have been told repeatedly to encourage handicrafts.
Ambassador Parthasarathi, going forward, as we have the Prime Minister now in UAE and a successful G7 summit behind him, going forward, how do you see India's position on the world stage as we encounter all these things? The Ukraine crisis doesn't seem to be getting over very soon. It seems to be headed into maybe a long-drawn thing now. We have India's regional security concerns with Afghanistan, and we have the Prime Minister now where he has met world leaders from Biden to Macron to the German leader. Going forward, what do you think are the areas that India has to successfully present towards the world so that one, it establishes India as a world power, two, also it helps us take a lot of things in advantage to India, that this is our position, but this is also bringing advantage to India as a world leader?
I think the Prime Minister is doing what needs to be done for the country. And I must say that my old friend and colleague, Mr. Jaishankar, they're doing a great job. The important point is now that we have things to contribute. Afghanistan, have you seen the way that the Taliban have turned in our favor? The way they welcome us? We're setting up an office there. We're not recognizing them. That's a different matter. But that we have conveyed to them that we wish the people of Afghanistan well. And over the last 20 years, there are so many projects which we should take forward. And that is the attitude which India presents. That if you are a friend, you may have been anything in the past. If you want friendship with us, show it and we'll respond.
Ambassador Parthasarathi, when you look at the economic side of the G7 nations, because the G7 nations also represent the world's richest nations getting together, and India has been invited as a special guest along with South Africa and a few other countries. Do you feel that this also economically empowers India today to speak up on very important economic issues? We've had the WTO, we've had other economic summits, but the G7 is the real one where the world's largest, the most powerful economies get together. So is this lending an economic heft to India apart from what we have talked, the cultural aspect, India's positions on world and global affairs?
Certainly, these discussions have led to, as I said, President Biden committing $500 billion to developing countries. And therefore, we'll certainly be a recipient when that plan comes through. It will take a couple of years. But the thought process has gone in. The thought process has gone into the Americans, which we've never had before, that an American president comes up at an international conference with the Prime Minister. And the fact of the matter is that we have stood firm with our interests with the United States. We have not yielded to their calls for letting down our Russian friends. And yet we've maintained our self-respect. Now, the important thing, that gesture of not yielding to pressure, everyone may say that, the Indians are difficult, but the reality is they respect you for that. And you combine that with going ahead and doing what you have to do, whether it's buying oil, or even in the case of wheat, we've said we'll export what we can, but we have our own demand.
So you believe going forward, India is going to successfully balance the Russia-US thing, and this is one big diplomatic.
I think the classic greatest thing which emerged in this, nobody raised a word. They had to say about our approach and our relations with Russia, and the fact we were buying oil from them. The fact is, we told them that you guys are buying gas from them, despite your so-called sanctions. So I think that a bit of frank talk was given earlier when the External Affairs Minister met them.
And with these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. We will continue to follow the Prime Minister's visit to UAE and continue our discussions. Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on India at G7 Summit. The participants were G. Parthasarathi, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.